And welcome to the latest in the Strauss Center series, Meanwhile in the World, in which, though never taking our eyes entirely off of the COVID-19 problem, we are trying to draw everyone's attention to other things that are happening around the globe. I'm Bobby Chesney. I'm a professor at the University of Texas, and I'm also director of the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. It's my pleasure to be your host today. I'm especially excited about this one because we're going to get to hear from someone who's really at the center of a lot of the most interesting events unfolding around the globe that relate to the intersection of technology, security, business, international rivalries, all of the above. And I'm talking about my friend Kieran Martin, who is the CEO of the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center, or NCSC. It's a position he's held since 2016. He's the only one to have held the position. And indeed, as I understand it, Kieran, the NCSC structure is in fact your idea, and you brought it into being within GCHQ, General Communications Headquarters, what we Americans often just call the British NSA. You were there for many years as head of cybersecurity and led the process of establishing NCSC. Prior to that, Kieran was the Constitution Director at the Cabinet Office for many years, where among many other fascinating duties, he had to grapple with the Scottish independence referendum. He served in the cabinet as Director of Security and Intelligence from 2008 to 2011. He's had any number of amazing jobs for Her Majesty's government. And I'm going to turn the floor over to him now for some 20 minutes or so of remarks. I'll have questions. We'll have a moderated dialogue after that. And then we have some of our students on the line. I won't ask why they're here and not studying for exams. We'll just hear what they have to say when the questions are ready. So Kieran, without further ado, welcome to the Strauss Center. Welcome to the University of Texas. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bobby. Really nice to be here. I always start with apologizing for myself. So firstly, apologies that I can't be there in person. It's not entirely my fault. I had hoped to be in Texas visiting family at the Easter break, but obviously a major global incident intervened. Secondly, I'm probably the only person here wearing a tie. I had to go in this morning to something, one of those old-fashioned things that I believe we used to call an office. For one of the classified elements of my job. And then I had to do a VTC with India, and it was all terribly formal. And I just haven't had time to adapt to the new etiquette of more casual-based clothing. So in the next 20 minutes or so, Bobby's asked me to do three things: not solve the world's problems, but firstly, just say a little bit about what I do and what approach the UK government takes to cybersecurity. Second, talk about current issues in cybersecurity. And then finally, just talk a bit about major trends and global tech. And the one thing I do want to do, sadly, so my final preamble apology, is to make this subject boring. This is really, really important. Cybersecurity is an over-glamorized subject that is basically about the management of risk. And I'll say a bit more about this later, but we sort of glamorize, we Hollywoodize, that's not a real word, I know, but we completely over-egg cybersecurity as a sort of glamorous existential threat that nobody can understand. That is really fundamentally dangerous. And at a time when technology is both a part of the way of getting through this crisis and part of the way of getting out of this crisis, when we're dealing with a real virus, the last thing I want to do is to scare people irrationally about digital risks. There are real digital risks, and I hope, if I've done nothing else by 5 p.m. my time, but don't worry, I'm not going on to 5 p.m. your time, and you do have an off button. I would like to give a bit of a rational account of those risks and some of the public policy and organizational responses to them, and then finish with a bit of geopolitical trends. So it would make sense, I suppose, to start with part one, who we are. The easiest way to explain this to an American audience, Bobby's already slightly stolen this on me, I'm afraid, is to move my head out of the way and say it's the National Cybersecurity Center, a part of GCHQ. So the easiest way to explain my job to an American, but it's very stark and for many Americans, terrifying way of doing it, is basically, to adapt President Reagan's famous dictum, I'm from the National Security Agency and I'm here to help. I'm here to help publicly. But essentially, my job is the holistic, whole-of-nation approach to cybersecurity, whether it's guidance for ordinary citizens, public reassurance in a crisis, or the covert interception and countering the most aggressive hostile state threats, and obviously I'm not going to talk too much about that today, although I'll touch on it in high level terms. That's all done within a subdivision of the NSA equivalent. When I put it that starkly to lots of US friends, and you are our closest partners, and my organization wouldn't function nearly as well as I hope it does if it wasn't for the NSA and other parts of the United States government, it's quite stark, and they say it'll never work here. My response to that is, I don't seek to impose our model on other countries. Cultures, political cultures are different. The one thing it's important, given that we are talking under the chair of a professor of law, is that despite the many commonalities between the UK and US systems, legal authorities in the executive branch are very different in the UK. Every time I talk to an American friend in the Department of Homeland Security's CISA or in the National Security Agency, they almost do a 30-second preamble telling me what authority they're acting under. And that will be, concept well known to Bobby, and I've seen some of his and the Centre's writings on major issues of controversies around executive branch authorities. In the UK, broadly speaking, if it's not unlawful, you can do it. And government machinery can be reorganized at the stroke of a prime ministerial pen. So I remember the bemusement, frankly, when post 9/11 there was the major congressional discussion around setting up the Department of Homeland Security. In the United Kingdom, the National Cybersecurity was set up by a letter from the then Prime Minister. That is the legal basis of the NCSC. It operates under some quite permissive GCHQ laws. It has very sophisticated oversight, but we could reorganize our mission based simply on just a piece of government paper. And that is common in the other Five Eyes countries with the sort of Westminster parliamentary system more than it is in the US. So I've now banished the former constitutional policy director out of me, and I'll get on to some actual cybersecurity. The UK's approach to cybersecurity is quite activist. It was very passive in the first decade, in the first half of the last decade, 2010 to 2015. And for my own part, and Bobby was kind enough to say I did play some personal role in changing the strategy, although there were many others. One of the most thought-provoking moments for me in that journey was at a conference, the private part of a conference in 2014 in Georgetown, when Art Coviello, just around the time he retired from the RSA company in San Francisco, gave a very compelling account of the US's approach to cybersecurity in the first 14 years of that of the century. And he went through two Bush 43 strategies, two Obama era strategies, and they all said that the solution was essentially more information sharing and more public-private partnerships. And that was the way governments approached cybersecurity. You know, the private sector needed to cooperate more, and the government needed to facilitate that, particularly through information sharing. And each one of these, and that was the UK approach. And his speech went on to call for, you know, really getting serious about that and making it work. We took a different evaluation, a different view of the same evaluation conclusions. We said, well, hang on, if we've been trying it for four strategies over 15 years, then maybe this isn't the right answer. And for all sorts of reasons, we worked out there were a series, and I can deal with this in questions, a series of frankly market failures and behavioral science failures in the way cybersecurity was done that was weakening Western allied countries in digital security. I'll say a little bit more in a minute as to why that is, but essentially part of the response of that more shift to a more activist stance was the establishment of the NCSC to do four things. The first was to grip attacks, was to deal with attacks. There's all sorts of parts to that. One is, frankly, dwelling in the covert world. It's trying to work out who is attacking us using a global signals intelligence aperture for, instead of trying to get the secrets of other countries who are trying to spy on us or trying to disrupt our well-being, trying to see what their cyber attacks, instead of trying to get their secrets, it's trying to work out what they're trying to get from us, trying to defend in signals intelligence against those threats. But then it's also about frankly managing the harm. So, and this can range from presenting covert evidence of intrusion into a major telecommunications network by a hostile power, all the way through, and this is a real example from 2015, to a teenager hacking into a customer database of a major telco and causing large-scale public panic. And in 2015, we didn't have a national cybersecurity center, and there was no one there who performed the equivalent, as we now have in all our countries, of a chief medical officer who comes up and says, I'm from the government, this is the quantum of risk, this is the affected cohort of the population, this is the level of risk they're exposed to, this is what people can do to mitigate their risk, etc., etc. That function did not exist in cybersecurity, it now does, and that applies whether the attacker is the elite branch of the Chinese or Russian state, or whether it is a basic, is a teenager seeking to extort money out of people. So that's the first part of our job, is managing harm and trying to make sure that the UK, the damage to the UK is cauterized, and that spans all the way from top secret intelligence through to the press conference. The second thing is protecting what you care about most. This is the protection of critical national infrastructure. It's something that we work very closely with DHS on, and we put out a joint advisory yesterday on what it's like in the COVID world. I think the COVID world, I'm not going to dwell on it too much at Bobby's request. The one thing it's taught us in my world is don't over-define critical infrastructure, because I care passionately about the digital security of things that 3 months ago I either didn't care about or perhaps hadn't even heard of. I had two major world-leading universities, but frankly, I'd never heard of their subdivisions that specialize in vaccine research. I'd never heard of these institutes before. I now have people watching them at their request. 6 months ago, I didn't care about them. It's an extreme example, but you get the point. A more prosaic example of this is if you look at dependencies, and this is why we don't go down a Franco-German approach where they list critical functions and they mandate their legal protection. There's a fascinating story, of which cybersecurity is only an incidental part, of a fire in a Glasgow nightclub a few years ago. A fire broke out in a nightclub in Glasgow, the third biggest city in the UK. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. But the fire was spreading, and the fire authorities said, who owns this building next door to this nightclub? We need to get the electrical and all the electrical connections to it disconnected, because otherwise there's a severe risk of explosion and so forth. And the owners came back and said, we're British Telecom, please don't do this, because otherwise you'll disconnect the internet routing to all the ATMs in the west of Scotland, and that's several, that's a couple of million people. We did not know that dependency. So you can say that the dispense of cash and so on is a critical thing, but frankly, you're never going to know that a building next to a nightclub in Glasgow actually hosts some equipment that could be dependent on that. So you need to take a more sophisticated approach to subsets of individual organizations. You need to work out dependencies and so on. So what we try to do is build in a concept about making it really hard to cause large-scale harm. So we believe in transparency. I'll probably finish with a little riff on transparency. But when we introduced what we call smart meters, I don't know if you use the same term in the US, but essentially energy consumption measures and so forth, that was a huge and vulnerable system. We've designed it in such a way where there are all sorts of regional off buttons. So yes, you can, if you want to harm the UK, you want to harm a particular part of it, yes, you can do it with enough effort. If you want to cause major national level harm, you're going to have to do 3 state level simultaneous attacks of high sophistication. And by that point, well, we're going to notice, we're going to probably know who it is, for reasons I'll explain in a minute, and we will have to respond in some way with our allies. So it's not that there's some sort of off button. You don't build in, you make sure you haven't built in a single off button. So that's the second function, working out what you care about most and giving it extra protection. The third and fourth are quite interesting to me, but I hope not too boring for you. The first one is about helping people to use the internet more safely. There are 2 themes running through our work, in addition to technology, and they're economics and behavioral science. Now, they're both inexact, and we're not slaves to either of them, but we're all deeply frustrated from time to time by our use of technology. And one of those areas is the way in which it's really quite hard to use it safely. So the classic of this is password policy. It was largely codified in the early 2000s in the US by an ex-NSA employee. We've talked to him, we've talked to others, and we've broadly begun to see a shift in consensus. But in economist or behavioral science terms, password policy is the classic incident of producer capture. I have a network, you want to get on it. I'm going to make it, to protect my network, I'm going to make it quite hard for you to get on it. So I'm going to insist on a really onerous set of password requirements, and they work for me. Unfortunately for you as the individual, you've got 25 of these, and operating them all together is impossible. So it's now de rigueur, and it's the norm to have password managers and so forth. But that was 3-4 years of really hard work and quite brave interventions that went against the grain of public consensus. The other week, we launched the world's first national level suspicious email reporting system. People said to me all the time, I've got a suspicious dodgy email. I'm not going to report it to the police because I didn't fall for it. But is there somebody who looks into these things? The answer until the other week was no. Now we're getting hundreds of thousands of responses, and we've already taken down more than 1,000 dodgy websites because we've given people somewhere to put this to. And the final thing that we do is we try to make the internet automatically safer. Vint Cerf of Google, one of the godfathers of the internet, has written and spoken some fascinating stuff about how, even from the point of view of a passionate believer in and builder of the free and open Western internet, it was designed without due regard for the people who wish to destroy it and wish to take it apart. So it's too easy to host a dodgy website, and it's quite hard to get it taken down. So in the UK, and this is just the one example I'll give, we automated a system for providing information, evidence of malicious code on websites that people were hosting, and asked them to take it down because most people were doing it unwittingly. We take down now about 250,000 a year, and the UK's share of phishing sites has gone down from over 5.5% to about a stable level of 2% because we've got the low-hanging fruit, and that's a reduction in harm to the UK and so on. So that's our interventionist response. But why were we doing this? It's because, for reasons that I'm not clever enough or well read enough to fully understand, and possibly never will, but the paradox for me of cybersecurity in the 21st century is that a high-tech, data-rich subject was driven in public policy and in commercial behavior terms for more than a decade, and in many ways still is driven by anecdote, lack of evidence, hype, and fear. I really passionately believe that when I first started at GCHQ, in one of those early public outings that I was required to do at a conference, the organizers played some video, and it was of lights going out, riots in the street, complete breakdown of law and order because of a cyber attack. And this is what we were here to. This was the real and present threat that we were there to thwart. Well, actually, I mean, you're all clever observers of modern life. Show me an example of where that has happened in one of our countries. Secondly, I know we're being recorded, so I say this at slight risk, but if you look at many of the commercial advertising around cybersecurity services, one thing you could look at is one ad which features Christian Slater, presumably for a lot of money, playing a character called the Wolf, and he stands outside the window of it looks like New York skyscraper, outside what's purports to be a major financial institution. He sends a sheep video to people at a printer saying that the printer's Wi-Fi is not protected, and brings down the entire global conglomerate doing that. And then it sells the services. I've dealt with more than 2,500 major cybersecurity, significant cybersecurity breaches in my time in office. None of them have involved somebody in a dark coat standing outside an office printer, bringing down a global financial institution. You cannot bring down a global financial institution from an iPhone through a printer. Doesn't mean there's not risks to manage, but that does not breed good decision taking and good risk management. There is a top end of the threat. If you'd like to know a bit more about it, then if you look at something like, three quick examples. One is the attack on TV5 Monde, the French TV station in 2015, where they remotely took out the broadcasting system of a major global TV channel. That's really, really hard, and very few people can do it. That's one. When you look at the very damaging theft of the personal data of more than 20 million American federal government prospective and real employees by the Chinese in 2014 through the Office of Personnel Management, that is a major and seriously damaging attack. And that shows about the importance of understanding risk, because there's a difference between an attack which gives you the email address and perhaps last 4 digits of a credit card, and an attack which gives you the full security clearance forms of 20 million prospective and real federal government employees, which is a strategic national disaster that was recognized at the time. So, and then the third and final example of that high end of the threat is around what was when the Russians disconnected 250,000 residents of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, in 2015 from the power supply in the middle of winter. Again, that is the high end of the threat. Governments need to do something about that. But actually, so far as we know, even with the Kiev example, the number of people actually killed or physically harmed directly by cyber attacks remains 0. This is more of a chronic than a catastrophic problem. There is evidence in some very good academic papers on the impact of ransomware on hospitals. Ransomware is when someone puts down a malicious code, encrypts your data, it's not usable, and you have to pay a ransom to get it free. The damage done to the ability of that hospital to function, of some hospitals to function, has been shown to incrementally increase mortality rates. So there is harm done. Apply that theme then to a business or a government institution. It's the efficiency, it's the efficiency harm, it's the financial loss, it's the harm to public confidence, particularly at a time when confidence in the Western model of the internet is beginning to wobble anyway, and that's where you've got a problem. And the solution to most of this isn't about elite vulnerabilities that cannot be defended. It's not about getting in the very, very best people, although if you can, great. It's about basic risk management. The final case I'll talk about before beginning the wider sort of strategic issues is an attack which we and the US government in 2018 attributed to the Chinese state. It's known in the industry parlance as Cloud Hopper, which Director Wray of the FBI described as an attack on the A to Z of American business. It was an attack on the managed service providers, you know, the big IT service companies across the world. And they got on to most of them, and through them they got on to an unspecified number of clients to do all sorts of commercial espionage. The way they did that, it certainly it affected most major market economies, and the way the Japanese have said it got into Japan was through attaching a macro to a Word document loaded with a 20-year-old virus that has been patchable for 18 years, and which any modern version of Microsoft Office would have automatically prevented. And that spins up a whole global compromise, because the networks aren't segregated. You can run amok, the virus can run amok through the world and so forth, whereas basic cyber hygiene would have prevented this problem. That is why fundamentally cybersecurity is and should be a boring subject about risk management. One of my favorite riffs is to tease energy companies, oil companies in particular are my favorite, who come to me and say, cybersecurity risk, I don't understand it. I say, you get fossil fuels out of the seabed. You do that safely. You do it in a way that manages huge political risk in many areas, environmental risk, and often in case of ex-nationalized companies, you know, huge pension risks, regulatory risk, and so forth. And you're telling me you can't find somebody who can tell you how to make a few computer networks basically safe. We need to train senior leaders to understand the subject a bit more. I won't, for the interest of time, bore you with the details, but we have given UK corporate leaders in both the public and private sectors a series of 5 questions they need to be able to hold a conversation on. I'll pick out one. What is your strategy for managing phishing attacks? And everybody says, we send fake emails to our own staff. We hire a company to do it. And they say, right, well, last year, 20% of your employees clicked. This year it was 10%, so that's great. if you don't understand what you're talking about, you think that's great. It might be great, but if the 10% includes the systems administrator and the 20% doesn't, I'd rather have the 20% that doesn't, because if I get the systems administrator, I own you. People need to understand that. That's an easy concept for sophisticated leaders to understand. So fundamentally, the breakdown of law and order, the riots in the street, the collapse of a company because of somebody hacked a printer, that is not the risk we're talking about. We're talking about a chronic set of exploitation of historic vulnerabilities that exist for all sorts of reasons, but fundamentally because the internet was not designed with safety in mind, and the internet economy that sprung up over the last 20, 25 years does not incentivize good security. So who's taking advantage of that to finish with, and how is that going to evolve? Given this is a big geostrategic issue and an elite university with lots of people interested in that, I will talk about nation states mostly. But I would say that for all of us on this call, including me personally, the most likely manifestation of a cyber threat is from a group of organized criminals, probably operating out of a non-Western state, because it's easy. And if they operate out of the US, the FBI will eventually catch them. If they operate out of the UK, we'll probably catch them if they get any level. But if you operate off somewhere on the Russian border with other former Soviet states, you'll be tolerated, and you can build up a fairly good cyber attack capability. But the four states we as a ally of the US worry about are Russia, China are the two big ones, Iran and North Korea. But they're all a little bit different. Russia, in our view, uses its expertise in cyber attack for traditional statecraft ends. So geopolitical advantage, espionage, pre-positioning, and so on, projection of regime power. China, on the other hand, the roots of the Chinese cyber attack system are fundamentally economic. They were about stealing intellectual property and so forth, part of that rapid expansion. Iran and North Korea have both been, they're less sophisticated, but their risk appetite is high. They will do things that they wouldn't normally do in the physical world. So they tend to respond to what they see as provocations, whether that's a film they don't like in the case of North Korea and Sony and back in the day, or whether it's a speech by a US business leader, as happened in Nevada a few years ago, and they launched a destructive attack on Sheldon Adelson's casinos. They will retaliate in ways that they would not do in the physical world. North Korea has now also morphed into, thanks to sanctions and its shortage of hard currency, into the world's first state-sponsored cyber cash criminal. The risk from the risk of terrorist groups' use of hostile cyber capabilities is low in terms of large-scale disruption, because it's quite hard to build the elite capabilities needed from via a stateless group that's trying to evade detection. But I think that is the threat that we've been seeing with and living with for 15 years. So just to finish, I would like to talk about how it's evolving as a strategic challenge. Because for the first time, and this is an issue beyond cybersecurity, we're actually facing a genuine challenge on the future of the internet. As again may come up in questions, as part of my job, we've been at the center of the controversy around the Chinese telco Huawei. And because of that, I've had to do business in China and so forth. And in the course of one of my official trips to China, I was in Shanghai about a year ago, and a very sort of interesting Anglophone business leader who had nothing to do with Huawei just said to me at a dinner, he said, I find this Western approach to the internet very interesting. He said, 20 years ago, you in the West lectured us that state control of the internet, state regulation of the internet was both impossible, and even if it were possible, it was undesirable. He said, well, we've certainly shown you were wrong that it's impossible. It's very possible, we do it. Now you guys, you're talking about child pornography, terrorist financing, radicalization, online harms. We warned you about all this stuff 20 years ago. You're coming round to our language. That conversation struck me and stayed with me, because I think we have, a bit like we assumed in the 1990s between the fall of the Soviet Union and 9/11, that the liberal democratic model had won and was universal and eternal. It was just a matter of time before it became universal. We similarly do that a little bit with the internet. It was invented in California. Sure, we need to regulate it a bit more to prevent misuse and so on. But actually, there now is, for the first time, a competing model of the internet. It's played out in really obscure bodies that don't command much attention, like the International Telecommunications Union, the various standards bodies, and so on. There are proposals for something called UIP. It sounds very innocuous, but it actually means that carriers know more about content than they currently do, and so forth. And this alternative vision is really quite important. In my personal judgment, Huawei's place in it is not the fulcrum of this. It's around things like foreign direct investment, our ability to sustain our capabilities in the technology of the future, our ability to sustain public confidence and industry expertise in those free and open standards on the internet. And frankly, I wonder whether my successors and me and so forth, people like me in 10, 15 years' time, will hark back to the good old days where it was just about repelling attacks rather than these highly complicated issues of technology and public policy. But because I fear it will be a more sophisticated interface, whether that's about the battle for the soul of the internet, whether that's about the balance of offensive and defensive capabilities, which I haven't touched on but could do in questions, or whether that's about how we balance commercial enterprise, the free market, with safeguarding our critical assets in the digital environment. I think, which is one of the reasons why I welcome the Centre's interests and very grateful for people coming, I think public policy leaders are going to have to be far more fluent in technology than they hitherto have been. I'm sorry if I've gone on too long, but that's my contribution.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. And just to pick up that last thread, certainly one of my abiding interests over the past many years has been to try to develop pedagogical innovations that would address exactly that sort of concern. I mean, basically, we want the lawyers to better understand the technology. We want the technologists to better understand the policy. We need the policymakers to better understand the business leaders to understand the law, and so on around the horn. We need that sort of cross-training writ large. And I love the idea that there's sort of this handy litmus test of 5 questions that any serious CEO ought to be able to address. I'm very much hoping you will not ask me those questions on this call, because I'm worried that I wouldn't show off very well. But back channel, I'll have to find out what those are so I can be prepared. I want to follow up. In a minute, we're going to involve some of the students, and students, I encourage you to just put the blue hand of Zoom up on the screen, and I'll eventually get to you. But for a while, I'll ask some questions in the meantime. In following the model, Kieran, of how you went through your progression, I want to start with some NCSC type questions so that I can better understand, and our listeners and viewers can better understand what it does and what it doesn't do, and how that compares to the way we do things here in the United States. So to preface the question, I'll note that in the course I teach that introduces the legal and policy and institutional landscape of American cybersecurity, we put a heavy emphasis on the idea that there are a bunch of tools that in theory any government entity might be given. You could have the power to prescribe specific procedures at more or less levels of detail. You could come in with the ability to pursue punitive actions on those who aren't doing enough to defend themselves. You could be in the information sharing business. You could be in the promulgation of best practices business. You could even be in the actual operational business of defending networks. So there are an array of things any one institution might do. In the American system, it's very interesting. We've got a couple of different governmental institutional players that have certain ones of those instruments. There are contexts where perhaps a government entity would be involved in actually being on your network and defending something. But for the most part, we don't really do that. For the most part, you're not going to find Cybercom, NSA, CISA, or any of our various entities actively defending a private network. There are exceptions, but the norm is that the private sector will defend itself. And what the government's really doing is trying to create incentives for the private sector to make optimal investments in that defense. To some extent, that's about setting up the conditions of liability. To some extent, it's something that insurance companies are driving. To some extent, it's making sure that there's the best possible environment for information sharing of indicators of compromise, that sort of thing. Where can you, within that framework, locate NCSC and what it's doing? Is it purely on the best practices and advice side of things? Does it have prescriptive powers? Does it do anything operational? How does NCSC fit into the picture?
Okay, there's an awful lot there. So firstly, we don't routinely take over the defenses of private institutions. There are two exceptions. One of them I've alluded to, which is at times of high threat, we will consensually help organizations. So vaccine research institutes. The other example I can think of, and it's not identical but very similar in objective in the US, is around the time of elections, given concerns about electoral interference. So we do things where consensually we work with political parties and the local administrators of elections to understand their networks and look at threats to them. And then the second occasion is when they've been attacked. So you can, I'll come to this in a minute, you can talk about and debate who's liable. There are very difficult cases. If the Russian A-team comes for a university, then in our system anyway, they're entitled to state help because it's not their fault, and universities or small businesses shouldn't be designed to take on state actors. That's not what they're there for. So if they want government help, and in the UK all of them will, if we come to them and say we have evidence that a major nation state is after you and so forth, they'll let us on their network. For the rest of it, we are trying to incentivize. We've not undertaken much. Indeed, you could argue we've undertaken no legislative reform of cybersecurity. So I'll probably touch on three quick things. One is the information sharing piece. We were set up under the then Prime Minister David Cameron. He accused us of being the best students of cybersecurity in the world. And what he meant by that was we keep running up to him with top secret information, which we know with a distribution list of about 5 people in sort of sealed metal boxes with keys and all the rest of it. And we'd say, look, Prime Minister, we've got this evidence of country X being on company Y, and we'd be terribly pleased with ourselves because, the work required to do that was really, really clever and really tricky. And he sort of rather burst our bubble by saying, well, hang on, yeah, great, really interesting. Well, then what are you going to do with this? Well, it's far too secret to tell anybody, Prime Minister. More and more in cases like this, and obviously I'm parodying a little bit, but more and more what would happen is Mandiant, as then was, would come out with a report that said basically the same thing. There was a huge pricking of our vanity bubble by the fact that there is a very good cybersecurity industry, a lot of it in the US, but not exclusively, and that if you approached them and worked in a bit of partnership with them, you could aggregate your capabilities. Actually, you could anonymize some of the really sensitive data you did have by aggregating it to more publicly available information. So now we release loads of information that would have been classified secret. So that's one of our core functions, and anybody can use. A lot of the times it's on a website, so it's not just a service for the UK if people want to do it, and we're doing that increasingly with CISA, and we've done that quite a few times. Then there is a thing about, in our system about regulation, liability, and all the rest of it. So the NCSC, we're not a regulator because otherwise people won't come to us for help, frankly. So there is something like that. We do tell them, we remind them of the legal duties and all the rest of it. We have a data protection commissioner or information commissioner, and so on. But I think increasingly, because of our expertise or perceived expertise, we are looked on as advisors to government on what the appropriate policy response could be. So I think in the 2010s we had we had two major changes. We moved to a more activist posture, more aggressive releasing of information, more aggressive government intervention, including taking down websites and so on, stuff that I've already mentioned. We had that was one thing. We had the second thing, which was the organizational reform that set us up. We didn't do much by way of policy change. So in the UK, we're left with a bit of a hodgepodge of regulatory and corporate governance challenges. So if you take the finance sector, it works really well. We have a regulator, the Bank of England, the central bank, that's responsible for financial stability. And it came to us and it said, financial stability sounds like cyber resilience should be part of it. Can you tell us how? And we said, well, here's what would work. And they said, well, that bit won't work in a financial sector. It's too expensive for the banks to bear. So they adapted it. And now you've got, in that whole sort of risk managed way, you've got cyber regulation baked into the economic model. In energy, it's completely different. The energy regulator works only really on price and physical security of supply. So we don't have the same incentives. And as for things like insurance and corporate governance, if I could change one thing in the UK is, I mentioned some of my previous career. 20 years ago, briefly, I worked in our Treasury department, and at one point was stuff came across my desk on accounting for pension liabilities and reforms for corporate governance for pension liabilities. 20 years on, I can read a set of financial statements of any company registered in the UK, and I can work out what their pension liability posture roughly is and how they're managing it. I've been the head of the UK's national cybersecurity effort for 6.5 years. I cannot pick up the same document and work out how a major institution is managing cyber risk and what its liability posture is. If I talk to if an insurance company were to ask me how should I approach this, I'd say, well, I don't know. So there is something about the way in which we're organizing regulation and corporate governance which isn't quite right yet.
That's interesting. That reminds me of something that was talked about a little bit in the United States, especially circa 2016, 2017, and ended up being mentioned in the Trump administration's early executive order on cybersecurity. There was talk about exploring the use for publicly traded companies requiring some degree of reporting of known or accepted cyber risk, as I understood it, as a way to put some amount of market pressure and increase transparency exactly on those lines. So the idea would be that you would certainly have to have a program of understanding what sort of known risks you were not mitigating against, for example, some decision not to patch. And you'd have to have some kind of transparency about that. That in turn presumably would create both general market pressure and some potential liability pressure. But I don't think that we've ever actually acted on that. Kieran, let me ask you something different that also is perhaps a point of contrast. In the United States, when we start talking about the environment within which the private sector is defending itself, we sometimes end up talking about what we call hackback, or this category in which maybe the private sector actor could best defend itself by going outside of its own network when under attack, perhaps going upstream to the attacker, to the relevant servers, or perhaps beyond them, into the attacker entity itself if it can, at least to go and see who's messing with them, if not to mess back with them. And of course, it sets off this debate about how that becomes a Wild West. But in our system, currently speaking, that sort of activity is profoundly discouraged by our Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. In the UK environment, with private sector self-help, is there a similar debate about whether and to what extent it would make sense to empower private sector entities, including the most sophisticated ones, say the banks, to be somewhat aggressive and out of their own network? Or is that not even something people are talking about?
I hope it isn't, because I think it's crazy.
The true Wild West.
I'd like to give you a more sophisticated answer than it's a Wild West, but I can't. It is. And I don't see, I mean, you're the law professor, not me, but I don't see the difference between it morally or practically between, allowing assault victims to punch their attacker in the face rather than, prosecute them through, the normal channels. I really don't.
It's an endlessly fun debate on our side of the pond. Going to a much broader perspective question, there was a little bit of reference to 5G earlier. Obviously, I believe it was NCSC's analysis, but I could be wrong about that. Maybe it was GCHQ more generally. expressing a lot of concern about the general quality of some of the Huawei products that have been the cause of such alarm. Can you just give us a nutshell of the British view currently on whether and to what extent we need to be concerned about the large amount of market share that Huawei has established in the 5G space, and whether to what extent we really ought to be viewing this as a significant cybersecurity risk, either from the perspective of state access, Beijing access to information flowing on these networks, or simply the overall cybersecurity quality, the hygiene quality of these products?
Sure. So still a live issue in the UK, parliamentary debates and votes due, so, can't say everything. But, and also just in the interest of time, we publish quite a lot. I think you're right, and thanks for the way you've asked the question, because you're right about, there are at least two different issues here. So, the UK, unlike some other countries, have had reasonably extensive Huawei involvement in networks for quite a while. And because of the concerns, we've had an oversight system for more than 10 years, which I'm responsible for. It was set up, its primary function was to test in a special factory for hostile state, backdoors and so forth, and report accordingly. We haven't had to do that, but we have been perhaps more busy than we would want or would have expected on the second point, which is the overall security quality. It's low cost, and one of the reasons why it appears to be low cost is that there are generic flaws in the security, which means that that need to be fixed. I think this is on the Huawei debate more broadly. There's a huge sort of geostrategic and political stuff for a set of issues for other people. So I'm going to try and focus on the technical. I would say that those sorts of flaws are the kind of generic ones. I've already said that cybersecurity across the board in all our economies is too weak. Telcos are a good example of that, but I think Huawei's equipment is the industry standard is below where it needs to be, and Huawei's is below the industry standard in terms of just the quality. They're not the sort of vulnerabilities that a nation state attacker would leave. The sort of clever ones that are very hard to notice. They're pretty basic. So we've reported on those. Then you raise the issue of market share. I don't want to say too much about this, but about how it came to pass, although others have expressed concern about, abuses and intellectual property theft by various countries and companies and so forth. But we've gone from a position where in the radio access network, it's quite precise about the masts and all of that sort of stuff for phone networks, where 10 years ago you had 10 or 12 viable companies, a lot of which were Western, to now, depending, you've got 6 in the world, but they don't all operate globally. So if you're a European country, a continental country in the continent of Europe rather than an EU member, which obviously the UK isn't anymore, you essentially have the 2 Scandinavian companies and Huawei and ZTE. Because the other 2, Samsung and NEC in Japan, don't really operate in Europe anymore. That's not a good position to be in. So however the Huawei debate ends up in the UK on 5G contracts, I think everyone is clear that there needs to be a diversification strategy. The interesting thing in the Washington Post about that today, and David Ignatius' column, for example, about the Open RAN initiative, and about, really, again, it's this point in public policy about technical details really matter. The fact is that at the minute, because of the way industry standards are configured and commercial incentives are configured, it's really hard to change your provider between generations of technology. So if you have Ericsson now, it's much more economic to keep with Ericsson. If you have Huawei now, it's much easier. Changing that and making them more interoperable is costly in the short term, but it helps restructure a broken market. So that's another point. And then there's the point where there is some technical disagreement, but it's been largely drowned in a much more geopolitical argument about what can you do with a base station. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, Huawei, interestingly, in the Washington Post article, is pretty accurate on this. Huawei is many things, but it's basically an equipment company. So it's not a data company. You know, if you're interested in the Chinese, sort of threat and risk around data, then there are many others that we don't hear so much about. You know, your Tencents, your Alibabas, you know, huge data behemoths. You know, Huawei, you know, do build equipment which can and is alleged to have been used for surveillance and so on, but it is equipment rather than, you know, they're not a sort of data processing company in that way. So there's a part of the debate in the UK, and it's the same in Canada, and it's the same in many EU countries, which is technical. It's like, you know, there are, you know, 100% provision of all 5G equipment by Huawei. It would be not an acceptable strategic risk. One piece of metal out there, you know, is not a strategic national risk. Therefore, it's a technical level. What is the comfortable level of national risk that you can bring in? And that's where the UK currently has got to. Of course, there are opponents of that position who just say, look, for all sorts of wider reasons, you should go to zero. So, sorry, long-winded answer, but three things. Substandard security, dangerously over-consolidated market, and then a technical assessment of risk. The final thing I would say, though, is that there is more to 5G security than Huawei. You know, countries who ban Huawei completely have a set of major strategic security challenges, quite boring stuff about how to secure networks properly, whether they and countries that bring in limited Huawei have the same problems. You know, so don't think that because whatever decision you take on Huawei is tantamount to securing 5G networks. It's not. You have to do a whole lot of other things that will excite much less political attention, but are really, really important. And the other thing, and I hope I said this at the end of my remarks, there's a lot more to Chinese tech and the strategic challenges of Chinese tech than Huawei. And so again, whatever individual countries do about Huawei's presence in 5G contracts, it's not even the totality of the whole issues around Huawei, because they do a lot more than this. It's also it's not the totality of the Chinese strategic, you know, competing version of the internet. It's not all about Huawei. It's not even mostly about Huawei.
We'll be talking about this for a long time to come, no doubt about it. I know we have to let you go in a second, but I wanted to give some of our students a chance to jump in with some lightning round questions, and I'm going to start with Claire. Claire, if you'll unmute, you can fire away.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, Mr. Martin. It's been fantastic. Devastated to learn that Mr. Robot isn't an accurate depiction of the threat landscape. But no, my question to you, I think actually comes at a good point with your last bit of comments. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about how the security concerns surrounding this new, like, more state-controlled model of the internet and data more broadly intersects with, like, the privacy concerns that we're all rapidly becoming more attuned to, especially as a lot of the world is considering upping a lot of regulations and controls to track COVID information or to, like, provide services. So yeah, if you could talk about that, that'd be fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. I think it's a really important issue. I think it's going to reveal quite a lot about societies, actually, you know, their tolerance for intrusion. And I'll just say a little bit about the UK experience in terms of where I started out and where I'm finishing, because I'm stepping down later in the year. I arrived just after Snowden. In fact, one of the reasons I was appointed was just after Snowden, and there was a sort of crisis of confidence in this. And I think that, you know, with the passage of time, you know, and the cooling of some of the heat, we can reflect on some of the lessons of that episode. And you can have a legitimate debate about, you know, the actions of Mr. Snowden and so forth. I don't really want to get into that. I do want to be slightly self-critical about about our approach to transparency at the time. There was a debate to be had, you know, it's worked its way through the British courts, and I think we were found not to have broken any laws. There was one or two sort of accidental bits of practice which courts found against, but the legal framework was found to be sound. All the applications for authorizations and so on were there. But the way I likened it was, we told our political overseers and judicial overseers, we applied within the law for the permission to lay each brick. We never showed them the plans for the house that we were building, and actually we never sanitized the public to the sort of edifice we were building. And if we had our time over again, I think this is a pretty unanimous view in the British system, you know, we would have said, look, I'm sorry, we're facing some threats. At the time, it was mostly international terrorism. There are trade-offs. Let's have an open debate about them. Obviously, we can't tell you every way in which these things are used. We can broadly tell you a bit more about the operating environment. We can have a reasoned debate about it. If you look now, compare that to, what day is it, Wednesday? Compare that to Monday, and if you have a minute, I would ask you to go on our website, ncsc.gov.uk, and you'll see there's a blog by my tech director, a guy called Ian Levy, about the new health service tracing app. And it basically says, and you can disagree with it, Claire, and you may well think this is nonsense, or this is offensive, or this is state intrusion, but there's 4,500 words for you there to actually debate. And it says, this is what it's seeking to do, this is why we're building it, this is the way it's built. Actually, there's a technical paper, which is, I don't understand it. It's way too techy for me. But, you know, it means that people, you know, Professor Snyder at Harvard and so on can actually have a look at it and say, you know, and publish a paper. But also then other people who are well-informed, reasoned people, but not elite cryptographers can also, you know, have a go. So I think there is a thing around transparency. The COVID thing for now, security and privacy broadly work they can work in complementary directions, because from my point of view, a very large scale personal data rich, medical data rich national database of COVID sufferers is a bit of a security nightmare, because if that goes missing, we've got a huge problem in the UK. So actually stuff that's also designed to help privacy, such as anonymization or attempts at anonymization and so forth, actually help, because it means that if this, if the cloud security on this gets breached, then the attacker, unless they're absolutely brilliant, have loads of time, loads of computing energy and a lot of luck, they've got a bunch of gobbledygook.
Very good. Willie, let me let you have maybe the last question. We'll see how this goes.
Thanks, Bobby, and thanks, Kieran, for being here. I wanted to ask about deterring adversaries, and in particular, the 2018 joint naming and shaming of Russia for NotPetya. I was curious if you could talk about how effective that public attribution was, and if you saw any kinds of lowering of attacks, I guess.
So attribution and naming and shaming is an interesting one. It's, you know, people say, well, it didn't stop the next attack and so on. It wasn't designed to. It's not meant to be a magic wand. It can't be. There is none. If you take the four state actors that I mentioned, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, if you just say, if you formally, publicly as a government accuse them of a cyber attack, broadly speaking, China cares. It doesn't like being called out. Russia and North Korea don't really. So if your question about NotPetya, you know, obviously the Russian government denied it, but did it, you know, did it lead to diplomatic pressure? Possibly not, although that was then different from, if you remember, the response to the horrific chemical weapons attack in UK soil. You know, the diplomatic response to Russia did have an impact, including some of its cyber dimensions. But then, you know, so you look at other things. So the previous US administration, President Obama's administration, started doing the indictment policy of named foreign actors, even if they knew that as uniformed servants of other countries, they were never going to set foot in a US court. We were very skeptical about this policy. In fact, we thought that it might lead to a dangerous sort of tit for tat escalation of, you know, people, our own personnel. That never happened. And actually, there is some evidence that it changed some of the behavior, and that what this did to some Chinese and Iranian named people was it put the West beyond their reach for travel for the rest of their lives, because they're under indictment from the US. So, you know, again, there's an incremental change there. It makes being a state-sponsored hacker in those countries a less attractive job. In the specific case of NotPetya, neither of those two things happens. You'd say, was it a waste of time? The one saving grace, because sometimes attributions don't achieve much, doesn't mean you shouldn't do them. And it's always, I mean, frankly, as a public figure responsible for UK cybersecurity, I'm always more comfortable telling Parliament, telling the media that I know who did it and being able to be clear with them than it does. But the one thing in the NotPetya case was the indicators of compromise. We actually published, that was the first time we published the technical details. So we were able to say to our industry, run these through their systems and deal with them. So actually it was a really practical, boring, incremental improvement in UK cybersecurity because APT28's fingerprints were published and we were able to take some remedial action against it. So you know, different things work in different ways. Nothing works perfectly, but it's worth doing.
So on that happy note, I think we've used more than enough of your time and we need to let you go. I want to thank everybody who tuned in for this and hope that you'll stick around for other episodes of the series, Meanwhile in World Affairs, because there is a lot going on around the world that we need to keep an eye on in the meantime. So Kieran, thanks for being a friend to the University of Texas, Hokum. And when things are back to normal, I know you'll have family reasons to be occasionally in the States, and hopefully we'll get to see you in person because we owe you some barbecue. And on that note, I'll say thanks to everybody, including our students, and wish you all safety and health. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.